Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture, our chapter one, kind of introductory to biology, what it's all about, kind of sciencey stuff. Before I get into the content, I wanted to make just a couple announcements about some of the materials that I will be using or you will be using. So during the lectures on my desk, I'm going to have the textbook. So you might see me look down every once in a while, just referencing the text. This is what it looks like. It is called Biology, Life on Earth with Physiology 12th edition. This is a brand new edition, so some of you may have found the 11th edition, which would work just fine for the course. Another thing that's associated with the textbook is Pearson, who's the publisher. They provide an online supplemental activity site called Mastering Biology. So if you bought the book new or you wanted to have access to that, you can always buy an access code. There's no assignments associated with it. You won't get points. It's completely optional. I'll have a link on the Blackboard page if you wanted to sign up, kind of the instructions for how to do that. But it's a great tool. I've used Mastering in some of my other classes. You may have in some of your other classes as well. But it's got some practice quizzes, practice tests, videos, animations, lots of different types of resources to help you, kind of like an extra special study area. All right, so again, just a reminder, the way that lectures work is I will be kind of narrating and teaching through these PowerPoint presentations. They're going to be downloadable or visible in Blackboard as videos, MP4 files. You will also be able to see the associated PowerPoint, just the PowerPoint presentation. So keeping that in mind. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So this opener here is just a picture of the Earth from the perspective of the moon. And one of the first things we're going to be talking about here in chapter one is what is life? So what does it mean to be a living thing? And as far as our knowledge is, the only living things that we know about are found on our planet, kind of that blue ball hanging out there in space. So we'll get started taking a look at the characteristics of living things. So when we talk about something living, we have to take a look at what that means. Biology is a study of living things, so we got to figure out what it means to be living. So I have a list here of things like a checklist. If you can check all of these boxes, then you're alive. That's awesome. So I'm going to list them here, and then we'll break it down in the individual slides so we can talk about each one of these a little bit more in depth. So the first one is actively maintains organized complexity, acquire and use energy and materials, sense and respond to stimuli, grow, reproduce, and evolve. Now, those are the ones that are listed in your textbook. I've added one more, kind of my addition, is that living things consist of at least one cell. So to be considered living, you have to check all of those other boxes, and minimally, you have to be at least one cell big. If you break a cell apart, the component parts are no longer considered living. So let's take a closer look at that last addition that I put in there. So there's this idea out there called the cell theory. So the cell theory has some statements in it. So one of them says that the cell is the basic unit of life, which means all living things are made up of cells. And then also another one is all cells come from pre-existing cells. That's not listed here, but it's just the idea that things can't just spontaneously appear. Living things cannot just spontaneously show up. There's some physical laws of the universe that says that can't happen. So I have pictured here an electron micrograph of a cell. So it's showing some of those main components. So the blue outline is the cell wall. This big blue circle is what's called the nucleus. These little green blobs are probably mitochondria, I'm guessing. They're just listing them as organelles. And then you have cytoplasm as kind of the orangey, fluidy jello that everything's kind of floating around in. So this is the typical cell. We're going to be learning a lot more about cell structure and function in chapter 4, I think, as we progress through the book here. Okay. So these cells, so what makes a cell? We just showed you a picture of all of those ingredients. There's actually 3 minimally required ingredients, if you will, to be a cell. One is you have to have genes, usually in the form of DNA. So these are the instructions, the blueprint, if you will, for everything that the cell needs to be able to do. So that's one thing. To be a cell, you have to have genes. The second thing is you have to have these little small structures called ribosomes. Ribosomes are like little workstations, and they can produce proteins. So proteins are a very complex, multifunctional molecule. And so ribosomes are the place where those proteins are made. And lastly, you have to have a boundary. You have to be able to separate the inside of the cell from the environment outside of the cell. So this is what's called a plasma membrane, sometimes called a cell membrane. We'll have a whole chapter talking about the cell membrane a little bit later. So to be a cell, you have to have DNA, you have to have ribosomes, and you have to have a plasma membrane. Now, most cells are a lot more complex than that, and they have all these other bells and whistles, but those are the basic components for you to be considered a cell. Now, since we're talking about cells, there's a couple different categories of cells. So we have a couple new terms, prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell. So there's root words, kind of Latin and Greek words you'll see, all of this new vocabulary, right? Biology is like a new language you're learning. So pro is a prefix that means before, and karyo is a root that kind of means like nucleus or kernel is actually what its really core origin word is. So prokaryotes are cells that existed before nuclei kind of evolved in the pathway of cell evolution. So prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells, EU is a prefix that means true, and there's that karyo root again, so that means nucleus or kernel. So these are true nucleated cells. So really the main differentiator between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell is, does it have a nucleus? If it does not have a nucleus, it's a prokaryotic cell. If it has a nucleus, it's a eukaryotic cell. Now they still have all those three components, right? So they still have DNA, it's just not in a nucleus. They still have ribosomes and they still have a plasma membrane, okay? So let's take a closer look at the details of each of these. So for prokaryotic cells before nucleus, like I mentioned, these are typically your bacteria. They are in classification domains called bacteria and archaea. These are small single-celled organisms. They don't have organelles. They don't have a nucleus. They're kind of the most basic design plan for an actual cell. And then here is for comparison, the eukaryotic cell, the true nucleus. They're very much larger and more complex. They have organelles, they have membrane-bound organelles, including the nucleus, and they are in their classification domain called eukarya. We'll see some classification here in a little bit. All right, so with the two groups of cells, we have with a nucleus, which are eukaryotes, without a nucleus, which are prokaryotes. Now, prokaryotic cells are always unicellular. You're not going to have a multicellular bacteria. It just doesn't happen. So all prokaryotic cells exist as a single-celled organism. Eukarya, on the other hand, can either be unicellular, like protists. This little guy right here is an amoeba. Or we can have multicellular organisms like plants and animals and some fungi. So we'll see that classification also in a little bit, just introducing these new terms. All right, so multicellular organisms like fungus, there's some mushrooms and some muscular system for humans. So these are going to be your fungus, plants, and animals. So they only exist as multicellular organisms. With an exception, fungi can be, some fungi can be single cells like yeast. So mushrooms are multicellular, obviously, but there are some single-celled fungus as well, so they can kind of do both. Okay, so one of the next thing here, one of those concepts, so we call it our all things are made of cells concept. So that other characteristic of living things is that they are complex and organized. So you can have things that are complex but not very organized, and you can have things that are organized but not very complex. So living things are both of those. They are very complex, but they maintain organization. And it is very important for living things to maintain that organization and that complexity. And there's this kind of overarching term called homeostasis, which basically means same. Homeo means same. Stasis, like static, means keeping the same. So homeostasis is what organisms can do, all from the single-celled prokaryotic bacteria to the multicellular largest animal, the blue whale. All living things maintain homeostasis. And what does that mean? It means they can maintain this complex organization, this status quo of normal, stable conditions. So body temperature, blood sugar, pH, These are all ways that our body keeps us in homeostasis, right? So we have a normal body temperature of 98.6. Whether it's 100 degrees outside or 30 degrees outside, our body has mechanisms built into place to keep us at that normal body temperature. Our blood pH, 7.4. Our blood sugar levels, about 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter of blood sugar. We have ways to maintain that. When we lose homeostasis, so when our bodies go out of homeostasis, we are usually in some kind of disease state or sickness, or we do not have health at that point. So for example, a fever. Think of the last time you got sick. So your body is no longer hovering around that normal 98.6. You might be at 101 or 102 or 103. So your body is responding to usually some kind of infection because a virus or a bacteria in your system is not homeostasis, and they're trying to get rid of that. So the way that they try to get you back into healthy state, raise your body temperature a little bit, and that's going to help kill those bacteria and viruses, trying to get you back into homeostasis. Or think about people with diabetes. They have unregulated blood sugar. There could be a problem with their pancreas, or there could be a problem with their cells listening to that signaling molecule of insulin. So when they cannot maintain that blood sugar, they are out of homeostasis. So this is just a big theme. All living things do it to help maintain that complexity and organization to keep homeostasis. Okay, so here's just some examples. Sweating in hot weather. So if our body gets too hot, our brain thermostat says, hey, we're getting too hot. So it tells us to squish out some sweat onto the surface of our skin. It evaporates, the heat goes with it, our body temperature goes back down. Or pouring water over yourself kind of helps out those sweat glands. Or shivering, right? So it's cold, your muscles contract really quickly. That burns ATP, this energy molecule of the cell, generates heat, warms up your body, so to try to get you back into homeostasis. Okay, so another characteristic, we see acquiring and using energy and materials. So here's a little water flea here. I think it's called Daphnia. It's not listed there in the book. So you can actually see through it. You can see some of its body parts there. And so this acquiring materials and using energy allows them, we can see its little gut tube. So it's got a mouth right here. It's got a little mouth. We have the gut tube. Here's the food. And then there's probably the waste products are going to be leaving out some kind of cloaca or anal opening. And then we can also see some of the other characteristics of living things. It has some eggs for reproduction. It has an eye to respond to stimuli. So complex and organized, that's a good example for that as well. So when we talk about things that living things have to acquire, the materials, nutrients are a big deal. So that's like food that they either eat, or like if you're a plant or a photosynthetic organism, you actually make your own food. These materials or nutrients we can get from the air, from water, from soil, from other living things. And they're constantly recycled. So there's lots of cycles out there. You may have heard of like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. These are all parts of these nutrients and requirements that we need for living things. So nutrient cycle, but energy doesn't. Energy is a one-way flow, ultimately coming from the sun. For most things, there's an exception we'll talk about later. But the sun is a one-way energy flow. So we get energy from the sun, it gets converted into chemical energy via photosynthesis, and then now we have food that we eat, like a carrot or lettuce or spinach or an apple or a banana. The things that we eat, that food, energy, the chemical energy ultimately came from the sun, and it is a one-way flow. So in this diagram here, you can see that as the sun is depositing energy on our earth, here are photosynthetic organisms converting the sun's energy into chemical energy of sugars, basically. Then you have your herbivores, your zebras in this example, are going to be eating the plant-based material. These are our primary consumers, is what that's called. And so the energy from the sugar in the plant gets converted into chemical energy in the zebra. So it's the meat and the muscle and the fat and the bone and the blood and this hair and the brain. All of that is ultimately came from the sun via the plant into the zebra. And here comes, you know, The lion is going to come and eat its food, get its nutrients, acquire its materials from eating the zebra. So it is a continual flow of those nutrients, but the energy is a one-way energy flow. And in every state of this pathway, energy is lost as heat. So during photosynthesis, the sun's energy is not 100% converted into sugar. When the zebra eats the plant, 100% of the plant energy is not converted into zebra. It's only about 10% efficient, 2% at that first stage with the sun and the tree. So we get about 2% of the sun's energy converted into plant material. And then from that point on, every time something eats something else, only about 10% of that gets converted into the next level of organism. The rest of that 90% is lost to the environment as heat. So that's our one-way flow. So sun into the plants, to the animals, out as heat, back into the universe, if you will. But nutrients are recycled. So the carbon in the sugar gets recycled. The nitrogen in the proteins get recycled. So nutrients can get recycled. Energy is a one-way flow. Okay, so here's kind of just some words to go along with that picture. So we have this process of photosynthesis, which is that taking the sun's energy and converting it into chemical energy. We have a whole chapter. You'll get to learn that process a little bit later. Some organisms can't photosynthesize like us, and so we have to consume other organisms. So the plants are the photosynthesizers. The herbivores are going to be consuming those plants, and then we have the carnivores would be consuming those. Okay, so our next characteristic of life was things respond to stimuli. So these could be external, things in your environment. Think about what's going on around you, my voice, my face, the color on the screen. You know, if something's going on around, like my cat's walking around, I can recognize that stimuli outside of my body. But I also have receptors inside, so I am constantly recognizing my body temperature, my blood pressure, my heart rate, blood pH, blood glucose levels. All of those things can send stimuli to our receptors that lets our brain process that and make a decision on what to do with that information. So we have external stimuli, we have internal stimuli. All living things respond to stimuli. That's one of the check boxes, right? So even plants and bacteria can respond to stimuli. I'm sorry, my face kind of covers up these words. I can't get rid of it though. At least I haven't learned how to do that yet. All right, so here's some pictures of things responding to stimuli. So here's a plant sitting in a window. You may have seen this before at your own house, where you put a plant next to the window, and after a day or two, all the leaves are pointing to the sun. They have this response to sunlight because they need to photosynthesize. You have some Venus flytrap here. They have little sensor hairs. They are not carnivorous, even though they're typically called carnivorous plants. They don't eat the animals to get the energy or the food necessarily like we do. They eat them because they need nitrogen. So they live in environments where there's very little nitrogen in the environment. So to eat an insect has a lot of proteins. Nitrogens are found in proteins. So it allows them to compensate for the lack of nutrients in their environment, but they're not eating them the same way that we eat and digest our food because they're green. They can photosynthesize. So they don't need the fly for their sugar. They need the fly specifically for one atom of nitrogen. And maybe you've had goosebumps before. Goosebumps is our way to respond to the stimuli around us. We might be cold or scared or nervous. That is one of our outward appearances of our body responding to stimuli. Okay, another check box that we're going to take a look at is things grow. So, you know, just look at your life around you. You started as a single-celled fertilized egg. You are now a multi-trillion cell organism. So you grew. Obviously, if you had kids or are a kid, whichever generational direction you want to look at, they grow. Living things grow. You can use your own body as an example. Bacteria grow, even though they're single cell, their populations can grow. They grow in size and then they split, and they grow and they split. So all living things grow. So here's some examples. A little lion cub will eventually become an adult lion. An acorn will become a huge oak tree. Here's a few bacteria reproducing and becoming more bacteria. So growth is one of those requirements of life. Okay. All right, the next characteristic, look in here, make sure following along. Living things reproduce. So there's a driving force in all living things is to make more of themselves, to make offspring. So this is a process of reproduction. It can happen in lots of different ways, but the two major categories are sexual and asexual reproduction. So asexual would be like how a bacteria or an amoeba reproduce. They just make a copy of their DNA, they split their cells in half, and their offspring are identical copies like clones. As opposed to sexual reproduction, where two sets of genetic information come together, forming a new unique organism. Okay, and because of this genetic diversity or uniqueness in these sexually reproduced offspring, we get a huge diversity of life on our planet. Here's a little baby turtle hatching out of its egg to represent reproduction. Okay. The last, I think the last major concept is evolution. All things have the ability to evolve. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about evolution here, but keep in mind when we talk about organisms evolving, it's not an individual thing. It's not me. I can't evolve. I can't evolve in 80, 90 years, however long I'm going to live. It's populations evolve. So a group of organisms over long periods of time have the ability to change some of their characteristics to better adapt to their environment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And a lot of times the driving force behind this evolution are changes in that gene, that DNA material, those blueprints, the instructions for all living things. There can be slight changes here or there that may give an organism the ability to make that change on a larger scale and pass those traits on to its offspring. So here's this little comic says, now that's what I'm talking about, is a beaver, instead of having to use their big teeth to cut down the trees, he evolved a chainsaw hand. Now, that's not how evolution works. Clearly, it's a comic strip. But the mechanism of evolution, which is primarily what we call natural selection, it does not give organisms the thing that they need. These are just random changes. And the organisms that are best suited for the environment, those are the traits that are passed on to the next generation. So you may have heard of survival of the fittest. It's kind of that kind of idea. So let's take a look at this. It's a very big theme in biology. It's a unifying theme. Actually, a lot of people say this is the core theme that runs through all of biological disciplines, no matter what you're studying. So these basic concepts, these natural processes that allow evolution to happen, there's 3 of them listed here. Genetic variations, that means organisms are different. Now we can have them be different because of that sexual reproduction we just talked about, or even those bacteria or the amoeba that just copy their DNA and clone, sometimes there's mistakes. You'll be learning about DNA replication later on, and there are some random errors, and sometimes those random errors do get passed on to those daughter cells, and that could offer a uniqueness, a mutation that could be beneficial to allow that organism to do something that everybody else can't do, or it could be detrimental, that the mistake is not going to allow it to do what it needs to do, and it will die off, and those traits do not get passed on. Which leads to this next process, is inheritance. So the organisms that are able to live to reproduction age and pass on whatever traits they have keep going. Those traits get carried on from generation to generation to generation. And so that's a very important part of this idea of evolution. And then lastly, it's the natural environment that selects for the organisms that are best suited. Like the beaver that doesn't get the chainsaw hand because it would be easier to cut down trees. It is the availability of those trees and the organisms that can take advantage of those trees, and those traits are going to be passed on. So the flat tail, the teeth that can cut through wood, the ability to hold their breath, they are thriving in that habitat of like a forest pond. And so those are the traits that are going to be passed on to the next generation to make them better suited for that environment. Okay. So when we take a look at that genetic variability, it comes down to the DNA. So the DNA is the blueprint, like I said before, for the instructions for the entire cell and the entire organism. So if you are talking about your multi-trillion complex organism, multi-trillion cell organism like us, every single one of our cells has our entire blueprint. And certain parts of those bits of DNA code for things that are needed for your skin cell to be a skin cell, for your bone cell to be a bone cell, for a brain neuron to do what brain neurons do. If there's changes in that blueprint, that's what we call genetic variability. And these changes are what we call mutations. So they can be random. They can be induced by environmental exposure to like radiation or what we call carcinogens or mutagens, things, chemicals from around us that can cause damage. Radiation from the sun or X-rays, those all have the capability of inducing those mutations in our DNA. And there's a beautiful picture of DNA. So it is what's called a double helix. And we'll get into the structure of DNA quite a bit later. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like. You may be familiar with the structure of DNA already. Okay, so when we talk about mutations that are passed on from generation to generation, a lot of times people think mutations, oh, that's a bad thing, you know, your mutation is going to cause you to die. Or you can think of like X-Men, where some mutations are actually pretty awesome. That's science fiction, right? So there's a couple different types of mutations. Sometimes you can have a change in the DNA that has no effect on the organism. It's harmless. Nobody even knows that that change actually happened. It just is a silent change, and there's no outward effect of that. Sometimes it can decrease an organism's ability to function, but not completely kill it. Sometimes it can completely kill it, and sometimes it can actually increase that organism's ability to survive in that environment. And so this is these beneficial mutations, or the detrimental ones, or the harmless ones. So all of this collection of these various types of mutations gives us that genetic variability, which then nature can start selecting for in those physical environments, temperature, water, food, all of these things that are required for organisms. If some animal has a upper hand because of a genetic mutation, they're going to be able to survive in that environment, and then they will pass that trait on to their offspring. Okay, so then when we talk about the selective process, so here's these random mutations, then what? Well, in these populations where those traits get passed on from generation to generation, you have to have, for them to pass on, the organism has to be able to survive. So to survive to reproduction, age or time or ability, so that one characteristic of living things is to reproduce. So natural selection will select for the organisms that are best suited for that environment. Okay, so organisms best meet environmental challenges will reproduce and pass those traits on. Mutations that alter genes will be passed on, especially for those mutations that are beneficial for that particular environment. So these changes due to the mutations and the selective pressures of nature are often called adaptations. So adaptations are changes in maybe a structure, an actual body part, or maybe a process, how reproduction happens, or how you process a nutrient, or how you regulate your body temperature, or behaviors that allow you to survive better or to find a mate. So those adaptations are kind of the outward appearances of this process of natural selection. And it could be over geologic time. We're talking millions and millions and millions of years to fine-tune these organisms for these particular environments. So as you can see in the pictures here, the polar bear is very well adapted to life in a snowy environment. The lioness is very well adapted to the grassy savanna. But if those were to switch places, those adaptations for the Arctic and the savanna would not go over well for the other organisms. So the polar bear would stick out like a white thumb on the African plain. It is not adapted for that environment. So it's this natural environment that selects for the organisms best suited for that environment. That's what drives this idea of evolution. And then if you can't adapt, so if the environment is changing, usually the environment doesn't change very fast. Sometimes it does, but usually this, billions of years that we've had life starting, 3.5 billion years, I think, when the first cell kind of showed up on the scene, environment doesn't change too rapidly. But when it does, and organisms cannot adapt fast enough, then they become extinct. So extinct is there's no more, they're not coming back. Even Jurassic Park can't bring them back, those scientists, you know. So species that cannot adapt to environmental changes will go extinct, like the dinosaurs. There's a picture of the dodo bird. In this case, the adaptation that they were not able to get away from new predators, and the new predators were humans moving to these islands. So because they were large flightless birds, they were slow, they could not get away from these new human predators. Their population numbers just tanked, and then they all were gone. They could not adapt fast enough with the arrival of the humans. So with this long natural history of adaptation and natural selection, we have a huge biodiversity on our planet in special places like coral reefs and rainforests. And you know, we're learning more and more, especially in the ocean when I'm talking about oceanography. So much of the ocean hasn't even been identified or discovered, and organisms haven't even been identified yet. So there's still a big mystery out there. But what we do know is when humans, you know, get involved in changing the environment, we are making it harder for organisms to adapt. And a lot of times our human activities, there's the logging truck showing there, building our houses, expanding into these environments, we are making it harder for organisms to adapt in such a very rapid time because it's not a fast process by any means. Okay, so those were our characteristics of living things, right? So to review, we had that list. So we had, just reading it straight from the book here, actively maintain organized complexity. They acquire and utilize energy and nutrients. They sense and respond to stimuli. They grow, they reproduce, and they can evolve. And then that last one they added is they're all made of cells. So living things are all made of cells. The next part of this chapter, we're kind of shifting gears a little bit, is kind of dealing with just the science, the study of biology, or the just study of science in general. So we're going to take a look at this diagram here. It's called the levels of organization, or levels of biological organization sometimes. But every level, you're going to increase that complexity and organization. So we're going to start down here at the very bottom row. This is what we call the atomic level. So chapter 2, we're going to get into here in a little bit. We'll introduce atomic structure. So what are atoms? How do they bond together to make these larger structures? So atoms are the basis, the foundation of biological organization. Even any kind of everything in the universe is made up of atoms. Matter is made up of atoms. Energy is something different. All right, if you take a couple atoms and you hook them together, you make chemical bonds. You take, you know, 2 oxygens, you get oxygen gas. You take 2 hydrogens and oxygen, you get water. You take a whole bunch of carbons, hydrogens and oxygens, you can get sugar, which is glucose. You can get big DNA molecules. So this is the molecular level of biological organization. So we've taken some individual atoms, we've put them together, now we have these molecules. All right, so then we have specialized molecules. This is going to be chapter 3 stuff we'll get to in a little bit. So those molecules come together into these different larger combinations, and then they make that first living unit level of the cell. So the cell is the smallest unit of life. When you break the cell open, molecules are not living, atoms are not living. They can't check all of those boxes. Cells are living. It's that kind of threshold, if you will, of life is at the cellular level. So some organisms stop there. That's it. They are unicellular organisms. They don't get any bigger than that, but they can participate in the environment. If you're a multicellular organism, you have cell types. So we might have a skin cell or a nerve cell or a muscle cell. And so these cells come together usually in groups called tissues. So think of skin as a tissue, or muscle as a tissue, or nervous, like your brain or spinal cord. So these are tissues made up of similar types of cells. So we're going to follow that epithelial, which is like skin, this epithelial tissue up to the epithelial cell up to the next level. So when you get a whole bunch of epithelial cells together, this is what we call epithelial tissue. Okay. So then let's say you take some epithelial tissue, you take some muscle tissue, you get some nervous tissue, You get some connective tissue like fat and bone and all these other different types of tissues. If you put multiple different types of tissues together to serve a function within that organism, then you have what's called an organ. So in this case, the stomach. So the stomach is the organ that's made up of multiple types of tissues. Okay. So then we have the next level is, let's take the stomach, which works with digestion, along with the intestines, which works with digestion, and the mouth and the anus. All of those different organs work for a similar purpose of digestion, in taking nutrients, breaking them down, absorbing them, getting rid of waste products. You put all those organs together, it's called an organ system. So some of our organ systems that we have in our body is the digestive system, illustrated here. We have the nervous system, the muscular system, the reproductive system, the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the endocrine system. There's 11 body systems. I'm flipping into my anatomy physiology content there. So you put all of those body systems together, and then you have an organism, kind of the level of a multicellular organism. So that is that pronghorned antelope, okay? So now we're gonna go on the big scale. So if you get a whole bunch of pronghorn antelope together, they're called a population. It's a group of the same species. So species that are all of the same. So if you are in a big crowded room of people, of human beings, you're in a human population. Or if you go out, I had right outside my back porch this last spring, I had a swarm of bees come over my house. It was kind of interesting and very cool. That would have been a population of honeybees, because they were all the same species, a group all together. All right, but most populations are not isolated. They interact with other organisms. So then let's say you have a population of these pronghorn antelopes on this plain, and they are interacting with some hawks and snakes and bushes and grasses and even the bacteria in the dirt. This is now what we call a community. So a community is a whole bunch of different species, different populations interacting with each other, the living things interacting with each other. Okay. The next level is, let's take all of those communities, all the living things interacting with each other, and let's have them interact with the non-living environment. So how do they interact with the water, the sunlight, the temperature, the minerals in the soil? So those non-living components of the ecosystem are now going to be interacting with the living parts of the community. And then lastly, you have all of these ecosystems on our huge planet called Earth, and this is what we call the biosphere, that introductory picture that I opened up with, the planet seen from the moon. So we have rainforest ecosystems and desert ecosystems and tundra, Arctic, Antarctic, ocean ecosystems, coral reefs, and deep sea and intertidal zones. So these are all ecosystems. All of the ecosystems that we have make us, give us the biosphere. And we don't know if there's life outside of that. So we'll just stick to what we know here on the planet. Okay, so then we can, we're humans. Humans like to classify. We like to put some of the similar things into groups. So just like any good human, scientists like to do that with living things as well. So they classify, they put organisms into groups with other organisms that have similar characteristics. So sometimes we already saw one of these classifications. That's the type of cell. Is it a prokaryotic cell? Is it a eukaryotic cell? Is it a unicellular organism? Is it a multicellular organism? Does it photosynthesize? Does it eat other things? So those are some of the characteristics that allow scientists to start classifying organisms based on these shared characteristics and shared similarities. All right, so here we have this diagram, broken it into the largest, these colored, the blue, the yellow, and the red are kind of these color-coded categories of the largest categories, the largest groupings of organisms with similar characteristics. These are called domains. So we have 3 domains. 2 of them are prokaryotic, and 1 of them is eukaryotic. So the bacteria, prokaryotic cells, they're single-celled, simple, very diverse group of organisms. Archaea, also prokaryotic, single-celled, simple, very diverse. but still all of the organisms in those two domains are prokaryotic single cell. Okay, but there's enough differences between the bacteria group and the archaea group for them to have their own domains. And then the last domain down on the bottom, this includes all the living things that are composed of eukaryotic cells. Remember those cells that have a nucleus. So these are usually, they can be single celled like protists and some fungi. They can be multicellular like some fungi, plants, and animals. Their cells are large and more complex, kind of like those characteristics we saw at the beginning of the lecture. Okay, so here's kind of a table. You have this in your book, I believe. Maybe this is an older one. It might be an older figure. But we can classify these organisms based, again, cell type, cell number, and that last one is how they acquire energy. So we have a couple different terms here. There's some new vocabulary words. We have what's called autotroph. Auto kind of means self. Troph means nutrition. So we have these kind of root words. So self-nutrition, organisms that can make their own food, basically. So those are photosynthesizers. Or that exception to where the sun does not give us all of the energy on the planet. You may have heard of deep sea hydrothermal vents. Well, there's a whole ecosystem of bacteria is kind of the primary producer down there. They do autotroph, they make their own sugar, but instead of getting it from the sun, they get it from the chemicals that are spewing out through these hot vents. Still autotrophic. The other term is heterotroph. So a heterotroph, hetero means different. So different nutrients means they're getting their nutrition from another organism. So heterotrophs either absorb it, like fungi. They kind of exude enzymes, digest their food, and then absorb it into their bodies, or we can consume it. So we are heterotrophs. Humans are heterotrophs. Most animals are heterotrophs. They are going to be consuming the food by eating other organisms. Okay, so there's that picture of a plant and a little bit more of the word description of an autotroph. Self-feeders or self-nutrition. Right? And then heterotroph, different or other feeders, so they have to take in nutrients from the outside world because they cannot do photosynthesis, or if you live in the bottom of the ocean floor, chemosynthesis is what that's called. Okay, so now that we've classified, we've put organisms into these big different categories based on their similar characteristics. Now, of course, we've got to give everything a name, right? What would science be without all these hard, complicated scientific names? So there's a big list of how organisms get classified, and the last two smallest groupings are called the genus and the species. So we have kind of a two-name naming system. So the first name is the genus group. That's kind of a group that holds similar organisms. And then we have the species, which says just this one organism. So for example, humans, our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapiens. So our scientific name is Homo sapiens. Trying to think of some other scientific names off the top of my head. I should have had that written down. I know lots of bacteria ones. So you may have heard in the news, E. coli. So E. coli, the E stands for the genus Escherichia, and coli is the species name. Escherichia was named after Theodore Escherich, the guy who discovered it, and coli stands for colon because it's found in your large intestine. So Escherichia is the genus, coli is the species. So all living things that have been identified usually get some kind of naming system in this two-name naming system. It's called binomial nomenclature. Okay, the last part of this chapter is talking about how science works. What is science? Besides just a whole bunch of new vocabulary and pictures and labeling and all this kind of stuff. Well, science is just the study of things. There's lots of different types of science. There's life science, which biology fits into that. There's earth science. There's physical science like chemistry and physics and astronomy. But no matter what field of science that you're studying, it kind of follows the same path of discovery, the same path of figuring out how things work. Okay, so there are some ways that science has changed over the years. Early scientists were more of naturalists, is what they were called, or observers. So we can just observe things and do our best way to explain what we see. But that didn't always work. And we'll see some examples here in a little bit. Some earlier thoughts were to say things happened by magic or supernatural forces, actions of gods. Think of like mythologies or old wives' tales kinds of things, that if you do such and such, you're going to get this outcome, with no scientific evidence to support that. Just a way of explaining phenomena that they didn't know exactly what was going on. Or the belief that all events can be traced to natural causes that we can comprehend. Sometimes there's natural things that we can't comprehend. We don't have enough information to make that conclusion yet. Okay. There's our friend Bill Nye here. So what we want to do when we are thinking about science and studying science is to think like a scientist, to be thinking about things based on evidence, repeatability, the ability to make conclusions that can be supported by further study and further evidence. Usually you do that with a step-by-step process that helps to rule out explanations that don't fit and to hone in on explanations that do fit. So the way that we do this is what's called the scientific method. So we're just going to work through this. You have a couple of examples in the book, these guys right here. So the bird tail one and the flies and the meat one. So those are really good historical examples of the scientific method and how the conclusions of those helped to kind of set down some of the key understandings of our biological world around us, whether it's dealing with spontaneous generation or dealing with mating habits of certain kinds of birds. So usually when you want to do science, you make an observation. You look at the world around you, and this was, this is happening all the time, and it's always been happening. So you notice something that's going on. So here you can kind of read through some of these questions. My light isn't coming on in my room. That's my observation. Then you come up with an explanation. Maybe the light burnout. Maybe there's an electrical problem. Something that's going on to explain that. But you don't end there. You can't just stop at that explanation. You got to dig further and try to figure out what the answer is or the explanation is to that observation that you made to start the whole thing. Okay, so then you got to set up an experiment. So you can test an experiment by changing out the light bulb. If you changed out the light bulb and the light still doesn't come on, you've refuted that hypothesis. That does not, so that evidence of the fresh light bulb not turning on the light does not support your original hypothesis. So then you got to change your idea. Okay, so it's not the light bulb. Maybe there's a short in my wiring somehow. Then you got to call the electrician, because that's something you shouldn't do on your own unless you are well trained. But anyways, in the process of science, you come up with your explanation. Then you design an experiment to test that explanation, your hypothesis. And if it supports it, then you do further testing to really validate your explanation. If it doesn't support your hypothesis, come up with a new explanation, you design a new experiment, and you're trying to find value in your observations and your experimentation to support your explanation. Now, then you can develop a conclusion. Let's say you did change the light bulb and the light flicked on. You can support your hypothesis. Hey, my light bulb was burnt out, and I supported that hypothesis because I put in a new light bulb and the light came back on. So that's your conclusion. It was a burnt out light bulb that was the reason for my light not coming on when I flipped the switch. Now in science, we can't ever say 100% that that's always going to be the explanation, because we don't know everything. We don't have all of the facts. We don't have all of the data and all of the evidence. So the best we can do in science is to support our hypothesis with evidence. If new evidence comes along, then we're going to have to modify our understanding. There's a lot of examples in history where that has happened, and it's changed our understanding and changed our way of seeing the world around us. All right, so here's a little diagram kind of showing the flow or the process of the scientific method. So you make your observation, you ask a question, you develop a hypothesis, which is this testable statement of explanation. You can make a prediction to think what you think is going to happen. you make your experiment, or sometimes it's an observational experiment, and then either your hypothesis was supported or it was not supported, and you have to go back and redo your hypothesis and kind of start the process over again. Okay, so when you are taking a look at your scientific process, especially what's called experimental design, when you're designing that experiment to test your hypothesis, you usually just want to focus on one variable. So it would be the light. If we want to go back to the light bulb, we change the light bulb and just the light bulb. You wouldn't want to modify the light switch and change the light bulb at the same time, because then if something happened, you wouldn't be sure whether it was the changing the light bulb or modifying the switch that got you the result. So when you're doing experimental design, you always want to do just one variable at a time to rule out other possibilities. Okay. Another important concept in the scientific method is what's called a control. So a control in experiment is usually something that does not get the experiment done to it. It's like the comparison group, if you will. So if you are planting some plants and you wanted to test this new fertilizer, so you might have a few of the plants planted with just regular soil and water and sunlight, and then and that would be your control group. And then you'd have your other set of plants that you have the same amount of water and soil and sunshine, but then you put the fertilizer in those sets of plants. So that's your experimental group. Your variable is that one variable is the fertilizer. Everything else is held the same. And then you have that other group where you have all the same water, sunlight, soil, size of the pot, all that stuff is the same, and it didn't have the fertilizer in it. That's what we call the control group, and that's your comparison. So if something did happen, if the fertilizer really worked, and your normal unexperimented plants were one size and your new fertilized plants were huge, then you can make a comparison. If you didn't do the control group and you got huge plants, you wouldn't know if it was the fertilizer that did that, or maybe you just bought big plants. So here is one of the examples from your textbook was Francisco Redi that did an experiment on where flies come from, kind of maggots, where they come from. So there was this idea, this well-held belief that living things can spontaneously generate, because they didn't have microscopes back then. They couldn't see bacteria or the individual single-celled organisms that could lead to other things. So what he did was he set up two jars. They both had some meat in them. And he had one that was open to the environment and one that had a little bit of cheesecloth, kind of like a gauze, so they could still smell the meat. They didn't have like plastic wrap back then. So he saw these observations, he did his experiment, and he saw that the maggots came from the flies. They came from the fly eggs, not that they just spontaneously grew out of the meat, the non-living meat. Okay, so there are some limitations, right? We can't know everything. So there's some limitations to the scientific method. We can never be sure all untested variables are controlled. It's too hard to control everything unless you're in a very tight, tightly modified laboratory environment, but that's not realistic. So in a realistic explanation of things, we can't control all those variables. These conclusions have to be tentative because more evidence might come along that could change that understanding. Okay, we have to have repetition, and we have to be able to repeat and get that same result. Sometimes, though, scientific experimentation cannot be repeated just by the nature of what you're testing on. And we can't use, there's some ethical issues, right? We can't have test subjects, control, and experimental groups, usually on humans. Can't do that. Okay. All right, so all of those slides we just went through is kind of talking about the study of science, how we gain knowledge via the scientific method. And then once we have a concept, an idea, an explanation for something specific that's supported by a lot of evidence, it usually kind of graduates to this idea of what we call a scientific theory. So a lot of times in common language and our normal syntax, theory means like I have a guess. I think that's what's going to happen, but it's not proven. A lot of times you might see theory used in that way. But that's not the case in science. Scientific theory is well supported by lots of experimentation and lots of evidence. It is a general explanation of natural phenomena, things like the theory of evolution, gravity, the cell theory. These are things that are supported by evidence, and we haven't really seen anything to the contrary at this point to change that theory into something different. Okay, so here's just a couple more statements on that. It's extensively and reproducibly tested. It's more like a principle or a natural law, and there's compelling, if compelling evidence arises, we can change it. It's what's called a paradigm shift, and we've had some of those in the past as well. So one of these big kind of idea paradigm shifting theories is the discovery of prions. So this kind of falls under my microbiology background, so it's kind of a fun story. So before the discovery of prions, it was understood that infectious diseases, things that you get sick from not internal things like cancer, you get from either a virus or a bacteria, or maybe a parasite like an amoeba or some kind of protist, single-celled organism or something. It was these other pathogens that would come in and make you sick. Well, there was this disease called mad cow, right? Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, where the brains of these cows were just being turned into sponges, big holes and pockmarks and things inside. And then nobody could figure out what the pathogen was. Why is this happening? Until somebody found it was a protein. It was just a molecule. It wasn't even an organism. It was just a protein. And the scientist put forth this idea that prions caused this mad cow disease, and people are like, you're crazy. That goes against everything that we understand as disease, our understanding of germ theory of disease. But he found more and more evidence to support that, and now we know proteins cause mad cow, and the other human form of that is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disorder, where you have a normal protein, that's the normal conformer, it's folded in a particular way. When that gets folded in a different way, they call this speculative or rogue conformer. This is the disease process prion, the diseased prion. And when that prion bumps into a normal one, it can actually physically change the normal one into an infectious one, so it can replicate. People didn't think that could happen outside of something with DNA as a genome. So this was a big paradigm shift in that understanding of infectious disease. Okay, so here's a little story. I kind of got a little bit ahead of the story. Stanley Prusiner identified this. It was around the early 1980s. All right. So we changed our understanding based on this new evidence. Okay. Another big concept about science is it's falsifiable. It has to be. We can't just say things are the way they are because and just leave it at that. So hypotheses have to be falsifiable. Otherwise you wouldn't be sure of your explanation. You'd have to say this is what causes it or this isn't what causes it. And so usually we just get rid of all the things that can't explain that phenomenon because of our experimentation, and we end up with the one thing that still supports that explanation. Okay, we're humans. We don't really know of any non-human organisms out there that do science. But because we're humans, some of our humanity comes through in our science. So that includes bias, that includes ambition, pride, fear, some of these not so good personality traits. So a lot of times science has these safeguards for that in these peer-reviewed journals, publishing your work, and everybody else has to take a look at it. It has to be repeated. So some of those things are in place to try to avoid some of those biases, but they do get through sometimes. And sometimes people just get lucky in their scientific discoveries. So here's a really good story about Alexander Fleming, who was the bacteriologist in the 1920s who discovered penicillin. So it was an accident. Like this wonder drug of the 20th century that cured almost all bacterial infections. Nobody set out looking for that. It was an accidental discovery. So he was growing bacteria in his petri dish, and they get contaminated sometimes. That's just what they do. But he noticed in one of his petri dishes the contaminant was this mold, and around it, no bacteria grew. He's like, he could have just said, and tossed it, but he had that curiosity and he saw this zone, this clear zone where there was no bacteria growing. So he did further tests on it and they discovered it was a chemical that killed bacteria. And so this was the first antibiotic kind of mass produced for the population, discovered in 1929, but was not really widely used until like the 1930s and 40s during World War II. Saved a lot of lives from infection from war injuries. All right, so this antibiotic discovery was an accident, which is kind of an interesting thought. Okay. So how does knowledge of biology illuminate everyday life? Well, you are a living thing. You interact with living things all over around you. You make decisions about your body, about your family's body, about what you eat, about what you do, about what you're exposed to. All of those things are based on the study of biology. So it can definitely impact your day-to-day processes, how you observe the world around you. Applying scientific thought to natural observations does not decrease one's sense of wonder and appreciation, but it should increase that because now you will have a deeper understanding and appreciation for how things are all put together. So science should be a tool that makes the world even cooler and more beautiful. So we'll leave you off this first lecture with a picture from the North Cascades National Park in northern Washington. I did not take this picture. This was taken probably by the prior instructor who taught this class. So there we go. There's our first chapter 1 lecture. So now you can go back through, reread the chapter, make sure that you're hitting some of those topics, try to write out your different characteristics, the difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, know the different characteristics of living things, kind of go through the topics that we covered in this chapter. All right, thanks so much. We'll see you the next time.